afternoon, everyone. I just want to say a quick thank you for everybody for joining us here today for the release of our new report, The Will of the People. My name is Matt Gagne, and I'm the CEO of the Maine Heritage Policy Center. And we're here to tell you a little bit more about what is inside the report and where this project came from and where we think it should go after now that we published it. I guess to take you back in time a little bit, we talked about this report for quite some time and began it several months ago. And essentially the operating theory behind it is that, of course, as we all know, every November we see a number of ballot initiatives on our ballot. And every year it seems like that number increases, but it's at least reliable. It happens all the time. We have a lot of these referendum questions. And frequently in the campaigns for these referendum questions, both for and against, you hear a lot about outside money and people who are involved in it and where the ideas are really coming from and whatnot. So, all that information is rather anecdotal. And we figured it would be a good idea and an opportunity, since this continues to happen every single year, to take a look at the initiative and referendum process sort of in a holistic view and try to get as much detail about it as possible, the genesis of it, where it came from, and what's been happening in recent years, to try to give you an idea of exactly how the system works, what is happening, who is trying to influence it, and how it's actually being accomplished. So the report you have in front of you, The Will of the People, How Maine's Ballot Initiative Process is Tainted by Outside Influence, is basically the product that we have created that seeks to answer those questions. So inside of it, we had a number of things that we found that I'm going to have Jake Posick, our policy analyst, who's the lead author of this publication, actually come up and tell you a little bit more about. But we are very pleased with this, and we think it's a very timely release, of course, with the upcoming elections. Because, of course, as we look forward in the future, what happens on the referendum ballot this year is not going to be the end of it. This will happen next year and the year after and the year after that as well. It seems to be the new reality. So we should understand it as much as we possibly can. And to tell you a little bit more about that process, I'm pleased to introduce the lead author of this publication, our policy analyst at the Maine Heritage Policy Center, Jake Posick. Jake.
Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. Before I get into my remarks, I'd like to say that the full report and 4 Excel files containing the data that we use to compile all the figures in the report will be made available on our website. So if you're interested in more information, check out our website later this afternoon. In recent years, Maine's ballot initiative process has risen to the forefront of policy debate in this city. In 2016, Maine voters approved 4 initiatives at the ballot box, all of which have been modified or repealed by the legislature in some fashion. Often during these debates, we hear the phrase, the will of the people, which is used as an appeal to prevent lawmakers from altering initiatives that pass at the ballot box, even when obvious flaws exist within the statutes. Typically, the phrase is only used to protect an initiative after a favorable electoral outcome is achieved, but rarely do we question how or why these measures ended up on our ballot in the first place. With this report, we've quantified exactly whose will is exerted at Maine's ballot box, and the answer is not real Maine people. Between 2009 and 2017, more than $81 million was contributed to PACs and ballot question committees that supported or opposed ballot initiatives in Maine. Among that total, 71% of all funds originated from out-of-state sources. Only 23% of funds, or 19 of the 81 million, was contributed by Maine people. The highest volume of out-of-state contributions came from Washington, D.C., New York, and California. Groups that supported ballot initiatives significantly out-fundraised opposing groups, which is noteworthy considering that ballot initiatives and veto referendums must be crafted so that a yes vote signifies support of the measure, and so the groups that bring these issues to ballot are always considered the supporters of an initiative. Supporting committees accepted a far greater share of funds from out-of-state contributors than groups that opposed ballot initiatives over this period. Supporting groups raised 61 of the 81 million in contributions and enjoyed a 3-to-1 advantage in fundraising that reflects a difference of more than $42 million in total contributions, or about $5 million per cycle. 76% of the funding among supporting groups originated from outside of Maine, while only 18% of their funds originated from in-state contributors. By comparison, opposing groups received 40% of their funding from Maine people, and while they received a smaller share of out-of-state funding, these contributions still represented more than half of all the funds raised by opposing groups. These findings show that regardless of position, Groups that participate in our ballot initiative process receive a majority of their funding from out-of-state interests, and that supporting groups rely on these out-of-state contributions to make their case to Maine voters. 76% of funds by supporting groups came from out-of-state interests. What's important to note is that between 2009 and 2017, more than 2/5 of all ballot initiatives considered by Maine voters faced no formalized opposition, but recorded contributions to committees who supported the measure. Of the 50 ballot questions, including bond questions, considered by Maine people over this period, in only 8 instances did the prevailing side of a ballot initiative raise less funds than their opponent. This brings into question whether the outcomes at our ballot box represent the will of Maine people or the will of the special interest groups with the deepest pockets. On average over the period, 61% of funds came from away, but the influence of outside groups has grown more powerful in recent years. In the 2016 and 2017 election cycles, out-of-state contributions accounted for 80 and 87% of all contributions. To be clear, our state's ballot initiative system is intended to serve Maine citizens when lawmakers fail to adequately represent voters, typically by refusing to act on policies that an overwhelming majority of them support. When an initiative appears on the ballot that has never been introduced in the Maine legislature, you can be sure our state's ballot initiative process is being exploited by out-of-state groups pushing a specific agenda. Unfortunately, as highlighted in our report, Maine imposes incredibly lax requirements on petitioning groups to achieve ballot status, and we do not employ many ballot restrictions that are practiced in other states, including subject restrictions, signature distribution requirements, and supermajority vote provisions. This makes it easier for outside groups to fund signature collection efforts in our state and push far-reaching legislation that has proven over the last 2 years to have several unintended consequences. In closing, I'd like to say that regardless of how anyone feels about past or future ballot initiatives, what we're experiencing at our ballot box does not represent the original intent of the system. Maine's initiative and referendum process was established to serve real Mainers, not outside interests. If the outcomes of our referendum elections truly represented the will of Maine people, outside groups would not have staked such a prominent financial interest in our state's ballot initiative process. And with that, I'd like to turn the podium over to the Honorable David Trahan.
Thank you. My name is David Trahan. I'm the Executive Director of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. I'd like to thank the Maine Heritage Policy Center for conducting this analysis of the Maine Citizen Initiative process. As a veteran of initiatives with over 25 years of experience, I'm a strong advocate of the initiative system when used by Maine people and when it benefits Maine people. Unfortunately, well-funded special interests from out of state, Unfortunately, well-funded special interests from out of state with no links to Maine, except money, have hijacked our referendum system to promote a national agenda. The amount of out-of-state money has reached a level that can only be described as gross. As this report highlights, and my organization has been saying for several years, 2/3 or more of the funding for ballot questions is coming from out of state to fund referendums not initiated by Maine people. Why is this an issue? Answer, because the initiative process belongs to Maine people, not non-resident billionaires or Washington and California-based special interests, who do not have to live with the consequences of their legislative experiments. Our organization has introduced several successful initiative reforms, including legislation to stop non-residents from collecting signatures, which is unconstitutional, reforms to separate notaries from campaigns, legislation to require disclosure of paid signature collectors, and most recently, LD 1865 to require disclosure of major contributors and close a loophole in Maine and federal law that allowed C4s, nonprofits, to hide major donors. Although this is a good start, more reform is needed. Geographical requirements, when qualifying for the ballot, legislation we have introduced 3 consecutive years, is reasonable and helps bring fairness for all Maine people. Over half of the states with referendums require signature distribution, and it's time Maine does as well. We hope this MHPC report, and one very similar being conducted by the legislature's Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability, will trigger a robust public debate on a system that is important, but one that is in desperate need of reform. With that, thank you.
I'm happy to open it up to questions, but just as a parting thought here, when we conducted this analysis, I asked Jake to just look at the system and tell me more about it. And it led us down a number of, I think, rabbit holes that just described for us exactly what the problem is. Right now, whether you support the initiative and referendum process in Maine or you don't, I think we should be able to agree that the system as it currently exists today is broken. And I think that the report shows that rather clearly. So I'd like to open up to questions if there are any, and we'd be happy to answer them for you.
Matt, what about the argument that some of these out-of-state special interests, I mean, some of real Mainers do hold memberships or contribute to some national groups, you know, is it really as disparate as the numbers make it sound? Because these groups maybe do represent people who do live here.
Yeah, we didn't try to analyze the membership of, you know, the various groups, you know, Maine Moms for Action, for instance, or any of those types of groups, in terms of Maine citizens that are members of them. But what I think is very clear is that money is driving the actual action of the referendum systems. And if it was generated inside Maine, if it was done with Maine donors, and if it was done with Maine organizations primarily, I think it would be, I'd still have less of a problem with it. It's still broken in a lot of ways, in my opinion, but I would have a lot less of a problem with that than if you see national organizations swooping in, funding signature collection, oftentimes with ads on Craigslist for people to come and get signatures in Portland. I think that becomes a very troubling situation, regardless of what you're referring to.
What you're raising is the issue of...
I'm sorry, Dave, I wanted to follow up.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to that. Because I've been involved in so many referendums, I see the intricate workings both internally, signature gathering, as well as where the funding is coming from. The answer to your question, I was asked this by a pretty, well, I think a very good reporter, and said, what's the difference between donations coming in for congressional races from out of state versus money coming in for referendums? Money coming in from out of state for congressional races is limited, it's capped. And those races are for congressmen and senators who will be affecting legislation across the nation. The laws that are in place once an initiative is passed only affect Maine people. So the people from out of state, particularly some of the billionaires who have been hidden by C4s, don't have to disclose who they are. There are a few major contributors who are giving to these campaigns. They don't live here in Maine. When the law passes, they do not live by that law. They live in another state. Only Maine people are affected. And that's the clear difference, is that people from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, from Russia can make our laws. We have no idea where that money's coming from. So it's not just across our country. Anybody across this world can fund an initiative here in Maine and make us live under a law that they want us to live under, and they don't have to themselves.
Did you guys find any evidence that there's money from overseas funding?
For question one, last year in 2017, the initiative casino referendum,
Sure.
There was funding from Tokyo, Japan. That's the only one I know off the top of my head, I
But
believe.
other policy stuff, there's not like windfall of money from the Middle East that's trying to influence the gun.
No, not that we've seen. I think what Dave's point is that it could happen.
Sure.
Right.
It's open to
Yeah, I
that
get
kind of system happening.
This whole question boils down to where the money's coming from to influence elections. Is there anything the state legislature can do about that, given the fact the Citizens United and its affiliated decisions by the Supreme Court? You were making a comment about money coming in congressional races being capped. That's simply not true, David. We got dark money coming in. More money is spent by independent groups on a congressional race than by the campaign committees.
Yes, and we also support disclosure, better disclosure. One of the things I found about Maine people in my 54 years in the state so far is that they don't like outside influence. They don't like people telling them how to live, particularly make our laws. I think better disclosure of that dark money for all campaigns is important, particularly for referendums, because that's, I believe, one of the easiest ways to hide your money. So, great question, but I completely support an extension of LD 1865 last year. I think that's the first law in the country where C4s are required to disclose their major contributors. If we have a law that intends to give people good information about who's funding campaigns, and then we have another whole section of law that allows that to be hidden, that's not honoring the intent of what I believe is the intent of not only the legislature, but of the voters, of wanting to know who's funding their campaigns. I believe if Maine people understood better who's funding it, more of these would get defeated.
And I have to be clear too, that's actually part of the goal of this as well. It's not necessarily to change the system in terms of how the finances happen, although, you know, it'd be wonderful to see that, I suppose. But it's really to just shine a light on how it actually happens. Who's buying these referendum questions and how, to better educate the Maine people so that they perhaps can make a decision that's more informed. However, I do want to answer your question though, because, and it's going to be a weird answer, I hope you'll forgive me for this one, but in terms of what the legislature can do, because there are proposals financially on what to deal with. They are not things that the Maine Heritage Policy Center supports, but I figure I should mention it at least. Patrick Corey had a bill, for instance, that would actually extend Maine Clean Election funding to referendum campaigns. And while I don't support it and our organization doesn't support it, it's at least interesting to me because it's trying to solve one of the fundamental problems that we see with these questions, which is a lack of parity. You have a question that's funded by a billionaire from out of state that gets a couple $1 million, and you have an opposition that gets funded to the tune of $50,000 from whatever they can scrap together. And when you're asking the question of what the will of the Maine people is being expressed, I don't believe that public campaign really gave an opportunity to the Maine people to understand the issue from both sides, because one side was at a gross financial disparity. So that type of a bill that he was proposing seeks to solve that type of problem. And while we don't support it, I like the tenor of where he's trying to go with it, trying to make the process a little bit more equitable so that when these things are run, that they actually make a little more sense to the Maine people.
But Goliath doesn't always win. I mean, the gun thing, you were outspent a
5
lot
to 1.
and still won. So, yeah, what about, you know, the money may influence this, but Maine people certainly, I would say, understood that.
Yeah, I'm sure Dave wants to answer that
Oh,
one,
I
but
absolutely.
Deep
But-
pockets doesn't always rule.
before he does answer that though, that's true, but deep pockets, in a campaign like that where you have Michael Bloomberg dumping in something like $5 to $7 million, and the opposition has a great deal less, they still had enough. That's my main takeaway from that type of a race, is the opposition had enough resources to run some TV ads, to do grassroots activism, to actually tell Maine people, this is why we think this is a bad idea or this is a good idea. In a lot of these referendums, you're finding that basic level of campaigning can't even be accomplished because they have so little resources. There's really no opposition of any note there to fight it. And that's a big problem to me. I know, Dave, you probably want to jump in.
Real quick on that campaign, I was the one that organized the strategy that defeated that. I participated in several in which we've won through grassroots. The amount of energy and effort that it takes to run a grassroots campaign, what I've seen is that you have Maine people who are affected by a law who get together and they go out and through a grassroots campaign defeat these things. That's the purest form of democracy, in my opinion. It's wonderful and it's exciting to be part of it. But in that case, I believe the reason we won that was because the message was there's a New York billionaire who's funding the other side. And to that campaign's effort, at least we knew who that was. It was a New York billionaire. And I think that's what ended up defeating this a bit, because Maine people understood where the money was coming from and didn't want to be under the laws and regulated by a New York mayor. And just to that point, a lot of these campaigns, you don't know where the money comes from, and that's what I think needs to change.
Also, in terms of things that the legislature can do, as I mentioned in my comments and it's in the report, there are a lot of different ways that we can reform the system that would make it more responsive to real Maine people. David mentioned it as well, signature distribution requirements. There have been some analysis done that have shown up in legislative testimony that show nearly 3/4 of the signatures gathered for some of these initiatives are collected in the 1st Congressional District. That's not representative of the entire state of Maine. So if we were to do something that required an equal proportion in both congressional districts, or maybe 3/4 of the Senate districts, or something like that, would be much more representative of the entire Maine population.
But that still doesn't get to the money issue that you're raising in this report.
I'd like to address that. I helped Patrick Corey write his bill on adding referendums to the initiative process. I came to the same conclusions you did, that the First Amendment and the Supreme Court rulings, the decisions of the past, are going to allow money into our election system. How do you balance that out to the point where you can have a robust debate on both sides of the issue? That is the crux of why we are here. There are organizations that have figured out that they have an advantage when they use their money and a referendum system. Not all states have referendum systems. Do you think Maine was chosen because we had a problem, or because we had a very weak and liberal referendum system that could be exploited by money? That very issue is why I am here, is why our organization is fighting so hard to bring parity and fairness to these debates. How we do that? Maybe clean elections is the answer, I don't know. But when you have the ability to buy up the airwaves, to consume all the ads on TV, and the other side has no money to counter it, you can and they will say anything to win. And we at least want the other side to have resources and the ability. And we want a fair referendum system itself. The signature gathering process is fraught with problems. There are people who are running all over the country as paid signature collectors, almost nomads, you might say, collecting signatures all over the country. Even when it's against the law to do so, they're getting paid with dark money, and off they go back to their states. I don't think Maine people support that kind of petitioning or that kind of outside influence. So there's major components that need to be fixed. I'm really looking forward to the OPEGA report that will be coming out. I think they have a lot of credibility. I think the legislature trusts their findings. I'd like to take some level of credit because I helped establish that when I was a senator and a representative. I think they're going to reinforce what's being said here, that most of the signatures are coming from Cumberland County and the surrounding area for these things, and a lot of this is unaccountable. An enforcement arm, right now there is no enforcement of our referendum system. The Secretary of State collects the petitions and finally certifies them. But who goes out into the field when they have a report that somebody from New Mexico is collecting signatures in Portland? Nobody. There is no enforcement. So there are things we can do. We should be examining penalties for those who violate our referendum laws. We should be looking at better ways to identify when the bad guys are here. I've seen people on film admit that they were from other states when they're collecting signatures. It's against our Constitution. I have seen people fighting over petitions and stealing their petitions back and forth. There are lots of problems that need to be cleaned up, because in the end, if Maine people lose faith in their democratic process, in their referendum system, it will undermine that system. And I think we're on the edge of a time when we start to lose faith in that system.
Would you guys feel the same way if the Koch brothers were bankrolling a ballot initiative for the NRA, if it was a conservative group?
Brought up the Koch of us, all right.
I mean, we've seen both.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Most of this is liberal stuff. Would you feel the same way if it was conservative?
Well, I mean, I'm going to give you an answer, but I'll suspect you don't believe me, but I do. I think that this is not the way to run this system, whatever it is. And I mean, to be completely forthright, the Maine Heritage Policy Center has been supportive of referendums in the past. I mean, obviously the Tabor initiatives are rather famously associated with us, and I think that is something that has happened on occasion in the past and was mostly driven from Maine people in that kind of situation. And I think that's the way that it should be done. And if some sort of group walked in to my office and said, I have $5 million to run a tax initiative or something like that, I really would not have much interest in that. I would probably try to steer them towards giving to our organization perhaps and lobbying in the legislature to get a bill through or what have you. But I just don't believe that that's the way laws should be made. The the initiative process, it forgoes so much of what I consider the important parts of lawmaking. You don't get the public hearings, you don't get the testimonies, you don't get the public input, the revisions. I mean, you're talking about the most extreme version of a lot of these ideas being thrown through because of a special interest group that is interested in passing something in a very specific way. And as I think Jake highlighted at the beginning, a lot of times these things have just tremendous problems that need to be dealt with. I mean, the marijuana legislation was obvious with that one, but you wanted to ask my opinion about what's happening with this referendum that's happening in November with universal in-home care. That's very clearly like printed off from an office somewhere in Washington, D.C. with a lot of problems that they're going to have, if it were to get passed, a lot of problems that they're going to have to fix just clerically, you know, I mean, the commas for clean elections and things like that. So I would say that I would hopefully be honest about that I would not be all that interested in doing that. Any other questions? I want to say thank you to everybody who was able to join us here today. And just as a parting note too, I know that this is not official or whatever, but I saw the news about Chris Cousins That is a terrible bit of news because he was a phenomenal journalist and a really good guy, and I'm really sad to see that. And just thought I'd mention it on the way out the door that was some very sad news that we received today, and I really do appreciate you guys doing what you do, and reporters in general. I think you guys do good work, and it's really sad to see someone like Chris go. So thank you so very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, guys.